I always tell people accessibility is a catalyst and a magnifier for change. And it could be either good or it could be bad.
Hi, and welcome to the HearSay podcast. I'm your host, Mike Paciello, Chief Accessibility Officer here at AudioEye. For the last decade, Gerard Cohen, a good friend of mine, has created and advised accessibility teams that have enhanced accessibility for millions of people worldwide. When he first started, I remember him enhancing accessibility on popular financial platforms at Wells Fargo, and then he's moved on to productivity platforms, including the pre-Elon Twitter. Currently, Gerard drives the Atlassian Design System Accessibility team, where he collaborates with an incredible team to bring accessibility features to popular platforms like Jira, Trello, and Confluence. Hey, Gerard, good to have you here with us on the HearSay podcast. We're really excited to have you, and I'm looking forward to talking to you. We talk about decades of being in the work of accessibility in your experience. Just from a personal level, what's your elevator pitch? How did you get into accessibility, and what are your the moments that you're most proud of, through your career?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I've, been doing accessibility enough to know that not everyone cares about accessibility in the same way. In most cases, it's something that people aren't just aware of or had exposure to. So a lot of times people will, when I tell them what I do, will say something like, "Oh, I never thought about that," or "I didn't think disabled people could do that or would want to do that." And so that's the first thing for me to make the point, like, why not? Why wouldn't disabled people want to do that? You know, uh, After all, disabled people, they're still people, right?
Right.
So, after that, for me, it's important to know what that person does or cares about most, and then personalize the message specifically for them. Some people, and again, it's based on types of exposure they've had to people with disabilities, but some people may automatically get the social and human aspects of it. And, that's great. I love it when I meet those people. Some people won't, salespeople, they want to make more sales. So I talk about the untapped market potential, people in legal, maybe they care about laws and regulations, and it's very easy to talk about that. Designers, they care about simplicity and providing, great experience for customers and users. And, talking to engineers are pretty much always looking for something to set themselves apart in the job market, at least. And even talking to QA people are interested in finding more bugs. So I tried my hardest to personalize the message so that it's a real connection. And as much as you can do that in an elevator pitch, the idea is not to sell someone automatically, but just to get them to ask, and be interested and curious to learn more about it, so that we could talk once we're walking out of the elevator, if you will.
That's one of the things that I've enjoyed about our personal relationship. Now, you and I have known each other for at least 10 years, probably pushing 15. And, I'm thinking back to our days at Wells Fargo. And one of the things that I've always enjoyed and appreciate about you is that you've got a well-rounded view of the entire, ecosystem of accessibility. So for you, it really is about the user. It is about the user experience and making sure that it's an enhanced, optimized environment for people with disabilities. So I really appreciate your comments and thoughts on that, Gerard.
Yeah, it's something when you're working deep in accessibility, especially in the ways that I've been able to contribute, you kind of do have to be a person that wears a lot of hats. So you have to understand, the social aspects of it, the legal aspects of it, and of course, the day-to-day tasks around design and engineering and stuff like that. So I've been very fortunate to be able to work with a lot of great people, learn from a lot of great people, and ultimately it's we're all looking for the same thing. We're just trying to make sure people can do what they need to do as quickly and efficiently as possible.
Yeah, exactly. One of the reasons why we're so excited, I mean, myself personally, having you on the show is simply because of all the work that you've done in the industry, your work at Wells Fargo, your work at Twitter, and now at Atlassian. It's really set a benchmark for a number of folks that are in the industry. Tell us a little bit about your work in bringing accessibility to the productivity platforms and the tools, the apps that you've worked on you use on a daily basis.
Yeah, that's so starting at Wells Fargo, and maybe we could talk about how I got into accessibility, but starting at Wells Fargo really set it off for me. But at that point I was working on the commercial side of things. which is really, our customers we were providing products and services to small to jumbo size enterprises. We weren't providing accessibility for WellsFargo.com and checking accounts. So I couldn't do anything about, that kind of stuff. That was a completely separate department. So, me and my team, we worked on the commercial side of things, and it was software that people use every day in their jobs for business banking or payroll, basically the way businesses move money around. So very early on for my team, we understood the mission and we saw it as we need to make this software as accessible as possible so that disabled people can do their job effectively. And I think it's something like 22% of people with disabilities are still, or actually have jobs. So it's a very low amount of people with disabilities that are employed. And so many of those jobs that they do have are in environments that aren't prepared to support people with disabilities, unfortunately.
Right.
A lot of times, even in the industries that we work in, a lot of times you're focused on external customers and you forget about, internal. So the software that we were working on was for, people doing their jobs. So, with these environments that weren't set up for people with disabilities, it meant that people, disabled people have to work even harder. And a lot of times without even disclosing the fact that they have a disability because of the fear of how, the coworkers and maybe their managers and how, people would treat them. So it became a matter of being able to contribute to the independence of people with disabilities, right? Um, Understanding that this is how people make a living and everyone deserves to make a living, everyone deserves to be independent and be able to do things on their own. And so for us, that was our mission, was making sure that people who were working in with these companies and doing finance and accounting type stuff, that they were able to do what they needed to do, as easily as possible. And that was at Wells Fargo. It's the same at Atlassian. So, here with a bunch of great people trying to make sure that everyone can benefit from increased productivity tools.
Did you do even in those commercial apps? Were you able to actually work side by side with individuals with disabilities outside of, say, for example, usability and user testing, where maybe you call in a sample of a sample set of users who are using those apps? Did you yourself get to work side by side with people with disabilities?
I did. It was far and few between, unfortunately, especially with UXR, that kind of thing. Because there were financial applications, there's a lot of like regulation and legal requirements and all kinds of interesting things around that. So our customer base was actually really small in comparison to some of the other products that I worked for. It was really like maybe 200,000 people at most, even though it was spanning, very large customers. So the footprint was really small in comparison to like, say, WellsFargo.com or even Twitter or Atlassian. So the opportunities, a lot of times what you have to do is you kind of have to try to find as many people within your inner circle as possible. So finding people within the company that had disabilities and really talking to them. I got to meet a lot of really great people that I had no idea were across the bank, systems analysts, people that weren't even working in jobs related to user experience or accessibility. They were just doing, everyday jobs. So it was very important for me to speak to them and make sure that getting their lived experiences was something that was really really important to me. So whenever possible, meeting and talking to people internally was really important.
That's where I think, as an engineer and a designer, contextual inquiry as a methodology is a great thing to apply when we're working with individuals with disabilities, because how they work in their personal workflow is not the same by and large as individuals without disabilities. And so to understand that, to grasp it, to watch a user go through through an application and that workflow is something that I think every engineer and every developer should understand and go through. Do you agree?
100%. I think seeing how people used the software that I was working on really really impacted me in a different way. I have a story actually. There was one project we were working on. It was an internal project, and we were actually, it was a hackathon, is what it was. And the task was to redesign and reinvent our internal time tracking software. So basically, this is where you would go to if you needed to request time off, or if you needed sick days, those kinds of things. And of course, the team that I was on, that we assembled, was very much so. interested in making it as beautiful and accessible as possible because the software we're currently using was not the best. It was really old, very legacy. Um, and so one of the things I did was, as I said, I reached out to disabled systems analyst I had. He was actually a screen reader user, a blind screen reader user. And I went and I just talked to him and asked him, I was like, hey, so would you mind walking me through like how it is that you go through and request some time off? And he was very happy, to help. He said, oh, sure. So, he walked me through and he basically talked me through, okay, so I would start doing this, I would start doing that. And I think the second to last step, he was like, and this is where I would stop. And I was like, what do you mean this is where you would stop? And he's like, well, actually, I can't get past this point. I think there was a drop down that maybe wasn't labeled properly or was in a completely different part of the screen. And he said, I have to stop here. And I asked him, so how do you request time off? And he told me, he's like, oh, I have to have someone else do it for me. And
Unbelievable.
yeah, he to him it was like okay, and thankfully he had people around him that were able to help him with that. But I thought it was terrible. Like here's a person that needed help to ask for time off. And something as simple as that, something that sometimes may be private, right? You don't necessarily need to tell people that you're taking time off and those kinds of things. He would have to ask somebody to help. And there was a lack of enablement and independence there. So it was, hearing those kinds of stories and seeing people use software and the different ways they use it is definitely impactful for anyone who's in charge of or taking part in creating these user experiences.
Yeah, that's a great experience, and I hope the folks in our audience get to that resonates with them. It is absolutely critical that we involve users with disabilities as part of our design and our development. In QA, we tend to always just fall back on, well, we'll just have them test it with a screen reader, test it with a screen magnifier, that kind of a thing. The reality is we get a lot closer to the accessible user experience that we're going for if we actually work side by side, walk them through like you did, and then hey, if we discover a bug, or in this case a literal a fault in the application, we can catch it then and improve it. Great, good stuff, Jared. I appreciate that.
Yeah, if I can talk for a minute about like the practical reasons why it's difficult. Like anytime you could get, someone with a disability to try out your software, the best time is at the start,
Yeah,
but if not, then right now is a good time to do it, right? So
yeah,
one of the practical reasons that a lot of people don't realize when they wait until the end is a lot of times some of the things that you run into are very fundamental to the design or the functionality of the feature that you're actually building or designing. And when you wait till the end, a lot of times the people that were there at the beginning making those decisions, whether it was, project managers or designers, a lot of times what happens is they've already moved on to a different project.
right.
Those decisions have already been made, they've already been approved. And so in order to say, you know what, we kind of we didn't hit the goal here. We missed a very important factor. It's hard to make that decision to roll back. So, and this is a lot of times why you see, experiences that may not be the most accessible actually make it out into the real world because, the best intention is okay, we'll get back to it, but we all know that day, there's always something else to fill in that day that comes in the future when you're supposed to fix it. So it's always better to do it as early as possible because you may have to redesign something and you want to be able to have the people that made those decisions take part in that and be aware of it. So it's also a learning experience too. They also, they take that wisdom, that knowledge that they've learned and they can apply it to everything else versus just like trying to fix a bug or, something to just move on to the next stage. So it's very important to do as early as possible.
Yeah, I totally agree. I often encourage designers and devs alike, build a good, strong requirements document and a pattern library. And those should integrate now all of the accessibility features and functions that we know are critical to the user experience. So that's a great touch point, and I appreciate the experience, Gerard. So you've seen the benefits in a lot of the organizations that you've worked with, and where by and large accessibility has been prioritized. There's usually a set of steps or maybe some sort of life cycle workflow process, that the teams use. Yet we're seeing a shift in organizations where they're deprioritizing accessibility initiatives. And that is so foreign from a world that you and I have come from over these last years. What gives? Why do you think that that's occurring?
Mike, I, I I don't know if we have enough time to talk about how I really feel about this, but you know, I'll say that I think it's mostly a lack of awareness, and just a lot of misconceptions to accessibility. A lot of times it's looked at as a blocker or at least a speed bump to creativity or productivity. Maybe sometimes the feeling's like, oh, this is going to cost too much. And sometimes, unfortunately, it's just ignorance or just, straight up ableism. Sometimes that's the experience as well. But like I
Yeah,
said earlier, some people, they really think, oh, disabled people wouldn't want to do that, or we don't have disabled customers, or not enough disabled people to make a difference. So these are some misconceptions that I think are very prevalent in a lot of organizations today, and it makes it easier for them to say, "Oh, we'll do that later," or "We won't worry about it right now," or a lot of times like, "Oh, this is just an experiment," or maybe it's just MVP. So they kind of rationalize themselves out of making sure something is as accessible as possible from the start.
would you agree with me that most of those decisions, though, are actually done at the business level, not so much at the engineering level?
My experience is the further you get back into organizations. So, we often talk about shifting left, right? Me with with the engineering background I have, it's very rare for me to encounter an engineer that doesn't want to be accessible. I mean, it's just something they don't know. They want to learn it. It makes them, they kind of geek out on it. Designers as well. To them, they understand the business value of, oh, doing this will make more people enjoy my designs. It's when we start getting into the business, areas and business groups that, they have a different priority. To them, it's we need to ship as quickly as possible so we can move on to the next project.
Yeah.
And so they're always looking at ways to like, what's really the priority here, and it's very easy for them when they don't understand accessibility, even if they know it's something they have to do, right? If they don't understand the real impacts to it, it's very easy for them to kind of push it down towards the bottom of the list, where eventually other priorities take hold, and it ends up getting left out. So I would definitely have to say most of my struggles in getting things to be as accessible as possible usually ends up being on the business side of things, for sure.
Yeah, I think it has an awful lot to do with compliance as a factor. In and of itself, generally speaking, compliance has this negative connotation. It is, as you said earlier, it is always used as a cost of doing business, as opposed to, hey, here's a feature that's going to change the world and make it, bring in more customers, more users, which is what we want, from a business perspective. But I've had the same experience as you. By and large, from the shift left experience all the way to the back, to the front end when you're doing the QA, designers, developers, and testers, they're all in. They're all in. They may not know it. They may not
Yeah,
fully understand it and grasp the concept, but once they learn it, they get it, and they usually apply it.
yeah. It's really difficult because a lot of times I think business people, like you said, there's compliance aspects to it. I think they sometimes they play a game of chicken. I've experienced and heard
Also,
some.
that's interesting. I've not heard that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like, well, let's find out if anyone complains, or let I've actually heard someone say, "Why don't we just wait till we get sued?" Which is a horrible plan for accessibility. Like I said, it's a way of playing chicken. I think we have right now, there's too much dependence on, like, specifically for accessibility and disabilities. There's too much of dependence on metrics, on user metrics. And as you know, Mike, right now it's very difficult to know whether someone with a disability is using your software. You really shouldn't, right?
Right. Yeah,
There's
it's against the
privacy.
law, right?
There's privacy aspects to that.
Exactly.
So they it's unless you ask permission, and you intentionally ask, for people to disclose, it's impossible for us to know the difference between, okay, here's a population of users that's not disabled versus that are. So they're it's hard for them to understand that, like, if we do this, the percentage of increase that you see is actually coming from disabled people versus like, oh no, it's just non-disabled people. So I think there's a little too much reliance on the metric side of things, and I think that's why it's harder for business people to kind of make that case.
Yeah, that's a great point, Gerard. And I totally agree. I think people are looking for payback, quite obviously, right? They're thinking, well, I've made an investment. You've told me more users will come because we're making it available to more users. But the metrics are really kind of leaning um, they become leaned on too much and therefore become an asset to the business, which doesn't work from an accessibility perspective because, as you said, privacy laws and whatnot prevent us from really tracking users and what their disabilities really are. So, how do you know if a blind
Yeah,
person's using your application or
yeah.
not? Right?
It really shouldn't matter, to be honest. At the end of the day, right? It's still a user that's trying to get a job done. One of the things a lot of times as I get into conversations with people, like I said, they kind of play a game of chicken where it's like, well, let's just wait till somebody complains. But as I mentioned earlier, a lot of times, people with disabilities will not disclose. They shouldn't have to. It's nobody's
Right?
business, to be honest. But a lot of times they're not going to complain because the complaint automatically discloses they have a disability or that they're having a hard time with a particular piece of software. So a lot of times that complaint won't even come in. They just kind of push through it and work harder. Something that may take a non-disabled person maybe a minute to go through could take someone with a disability, depending on what it is, could take 5 minutes. And so what happens is they end up staying later. They work through lunch, maybe, they work a lot harder because they're not going to complain. And so waiting, business people waiting to hear for complaints from the disabled community, it's just, it makes things harder for us for sure.
So, on a personal level, how would you change things? Or what do you think needs to be changed so that everybody is more in, or at least making business decisions that are more supportive of accessibility?
So Mike, that's a great question. So I think the most important thing is awareness and training. That's usually where I try to start with. I think everybody needs to be bought in from top to bottom because a lot of times people feel that accessibility is just an engineering problem to solve, but really everyone has a part to play. And when I'm talking to people, you know, like I said earlier, there's everyone has their own motivations, their own priorities. So it's really just trying to make sure that I'm educating them and exposing them to the reasons why it's important for them in their craft or in their business responsibility that accessibility is important. But after that, I mean, the one thing that I always recommend people is just take it one step at a time. Really, you hear a lot of people in the community say progress over perfection, which is something that Merrill Evans, who's probably
Right?
after you, one of my most favorite people in the space, coined that term. But honestly, I kind of have like a spin on that, because I don't think disabled people are looking for perfection. I think they just want equity and independence. So what I like to tell my teams is something slightly different, and it's really just progress is all that's required from you, and our goal is to make things incrementally better, than we did yesterday. And the last thing I tell people is this is no different than any other important initiative. If you're starting at a huge backlog of accessibility specific bugs, you treat it the same way as you would, any other backlog of bugs. If you need to know what disabled people are thinking or liking or doing, then you do UXR and ethnography. It's all the same. Everyone
Right?
understands these concepts. I'm just here to get you to expand your scope to be more inclusive and really just be more honest with your reflection of humanity. To be
Yeah,
clear.
you've touched on a couple of things that I've now for years I was saying it's all about making a commitment to progress. We know, I mean, this goes back to my early days when I was working and consulting with Adobe and Acrobat and PDF were brand new technologies. Um, and everybody was fighting against them just the same way we're seeing some of the organizations fighting against overlays and AI and automation, right? Back then, it was all about PDF and Acrobat and how you were ruining, taking pictures of words, and how are we ever going to be able to, in what I explained to the folks on the Adobe team that is, look, show a commitment to progress. We know you're not going to be able to solve all of the problems of what this new technology that has a place in this in our ecosystem, in the technology ecosystem, right? But make a commitment to progress towards accessibility, and then be transparent. Or you talked about being trustful, right? So when you make a commitment, don't over promise and under deliver, right? As you'll say goes, but show what you've done and where you're going. People with disabilities will buy into that as long as you're being communicative, as long as you're being trustworthy, as long as you're being transparent about what you're doing. They will support you.
Yeah, that's a great point. It reminds me of my team at Twitter and what we were trying to do. Obviously, going from Wells Fargo to Twitter, I wasn't used to how fast we got feedback from people using Twitter. I mean, it was instant.
Yeah,
They're tweeting back at us. Once they get your personal handle, they would tweet. Like I would get tweets all the time, people complaining about stuff. And one of the things that we did with our main account was we started to monthly post the work that we just finished, the work that we were starting, and then stuff that was coming up in the future. And that made a big difference. And we were very transparent. We were very honest and say, hey, our best intention was, I know we said last week, or last month we were going to get this feature out. Unfortunately, we couldn't do it, but here's what we're working on. And we got such a great response from that. It was never perfect. We had a lot of work to do. It was a small team. We had a short amount of time, but having that transparency and commitment gave everyone the trust that they needed to know that, hey, if it was up to us, we'd snap our fingers and everything would be done, right? But
yeah,
it was a
yeah,
progress and we were working through it, and they trusted us that we were doing our best to make those incremental steps. So
exactly.
definitely sharing that. It's tough for some organizations. I know
Yep,
it was a big risk for us, but it was Twitter, so we
yeah.
were able to do that. I don't see Wells Fargo, something as serious, being able to provide those kind of updates, maybe, just because of, like I said, heavily regulated. But having some kind of communication with the community is absolutely imperative to gaining that trust from the community.
It was an interesting call out that you just made in relation to immediate feedback, user feedback in the Twitter sphere versus slow mechanical you know uh, error, systems that were force you at Wells Fargo. So that's an interesting dynamic, depending on the type of organization. But how about now? Let's say Atlassian and in the products that you're delivering there. Do you see any major differences in approach or an activity in that environment versus say Wells Fargo, the commercial banking, or Twitter, where you're doing more one to one peer to peer user?
Yeah, I'd say Atlassian's a lot closer to Wells Fargo in the sense that I'm working on a design system. I'm really super far removed from the people that are actually using our products. But the interesting thing is because most of Atlassian's user base are designers and engineers. They kind of understand the work that we're doing, so feedback comes in and it's super detailed. It's really fascinating to see the feedback that comes in month to month, where people are really just picking out particular portions of a screen or a functionality and giving really good feedback. So um, in that sense, it's a lot better than Wells Fargo. Not the same as Twitter. Also, the thing that's missing is, again, on Twitter, it was very easy to understand that someone was talking about maybe some functionality or a portion of the app that wasn't accessible. Whereas at Atlassian, I don't really get that specific feedback, other than from my friends and peers that work in the industry.
Right,
I get
right.
I get text messages and emails all the time, like, "Hey, what's going on with Jira? I can't do this thing,"
Yeah.
or a Confluence. So that anecdotal feedback and that
You
personal
can just
relationship that has with people really helps too.
Yeah, knowing some of our common friends, I could just imagine who they are. Hey, let's change a course here just a little bit. What are the biggest misconceptions about accessibility or in accessibility implementation that you see in your work?
Wow, so many. I already talked about the misconceptions that accessibility was a blocker to creativity or productivity. that is very prevalent, but I come across a lot of just fundamental accessibility myths. And again, it depends on how much exposure you've had to people with disabilities. But you know, a lot of times people think disability is someone in a wheelchair or a blind person with a cane,
Mm,
right? But there's such a large gradient of people with disabilities, and even if we can break them down into like maybe five disability types, a lot of times people will have more than one disability. Uh, and so, a lot of times people think, that you can only be born with a disability. A lot of, people, I hear people say that versus, unfortunately, maybe there's, an accident or a disability caused by illness. We're getting through COVID right now. There's a lot of things that are coming up based on that. A lot of
right.
people are waking up to finding out that maybe, maybe they've lost some hearing due to COVID. There's just so many things that are coming out of COVID. Or for me personally, it's even just getting older, you know,
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
as we age, most likely you'll start to move a little bit slower. You start to hear a little less. So there's just so many, like I said, there's so many gradients to disabilities and how someone can develop or be born or, experience a disability. So that's one of the biggest myths because we're all working with people that unfortunately they're sighted mouse users, and that's the experience they're used to, and they think that
Yep.
that's the way the rest of the world is. So, just the exposure of no, disability, majority of them you can't even see. And like I said, since people aren't going to disclose them, they don't have a right to. I mean, they don't have to.
Yeah.
Uh, you're probably working next to somebody with a disability. If we believe the stat that a minimum 25% of, let's just say the U.S., minimum of 25% of people in the U.S. has a disability, that there's somebody in your office that has a disability that you don't know about. So I like to remind people when sometimes when you say those horrible things about people with disabilities, which I hear, unfortunately, you could be saying that about someone either that has a disability or maybe has a child or someone in their family has a disability.
Yeah.
So you really got to think about it, how we're talking and treating people with disabilities.
As you're talking, I'm thinking, yeah, and now that we're more into a digital society, the uh, that's much more likely to happen, right? I mean, you could be. I mean, it'll be eventually we'll all be avatars, right? And we'll be talking to each other, and you won't know whether a person has a disability or not, right? Because they're just an avatar, and they've created themselves with whatever features that they want to have. So it'll make it quite interesting, as the future moves on.
Yeah, I'm not necessarily sure I'll be one of those people with the avatar. I very much so
Yeah,
enjoy
yeah,
my,
yeah,
but that's the thing about digital applications and products and services is again it's an equalizer. It doesn't matter if you have a disability at all. Like someone should be able to do something, and I think that's the best thing about the internet is it doesn't matter if you have a disability. If you do the right things, if you implement accessibility, then anyone can do anything.
I wondered. I'm just thinking off the cuff here. I did a lot of work on persona development with Whitney Quisenberry and oh my goodness, what's her name there? Sarah Horton, right? How could I forget Sarah? Uh, and they did an awful lot about developing personas around individuals with disabilities, right? Describing what their capabilities were and what their daily life was like. Wouldn't it be cool if we could develop those personas and then adapt them to myself as a user in an interaction that I'm doing in a digital space, right? So now I really get the feel and the real sense of what it means to be blind, to be an individual who's perhaps missing limbs, dexterity, right? Limitations at that level, no voice, right? No, the inability to be able to speak, or to be a person with Parkinson's or MS, where speaking quality is tempered by by the disability that I have there. Putting on those personas and actually operating in that environment and learning how those users live every day is I see that as a value add somewhere down the line.
Yeah, possibly that could work with some people, but a lot of times what I like to do is educate people around, situational disabilities or temporary disabilities.
Mhm.
For example, when I was working in the Bay Area, riding BART, and you're holding on for dear life,
Yeah.
and you're trying to do something with just one hand, right?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
maybe you're holding a baby, and I've done this a lot too. Like, I'm at work and I'm eating a pizza while trying to do, my job on the keyboard.
Yeah.
These are situational disabilities that you find yourself in. Maybe I had a really bad night's sleep, and it's taking me a little bit longer to connect the dots,
Yeah.
and answer so many questions that I have to. These are situational disabilities that I think everyone can relate to. They've been through, throughout the course of their workday, and they could see why. Yeah, it'd be nice if I had something to help me with those things. Maybe I'm taking some medication that makes me a little bit drowsy. I can't take time off from work, unfortunately, right?
Right.
I still got to push through it. A lot of people have jobs where they don't have the luxury of just saying, "Hey, I don't feel good. I'm going to take the day off." So they got to push through. Maybe it's some drowsy medication. It'd be nice if there was some kind of affordance or assistive technology that can help people get through those things, and people understand those stories. They go through them every day, so you don't
Right.
necessarily have to go through like the extremes of simulating someone missing a hand or those kinds of things. So I
Yeah.
think there's ways that we can get people to empathize with those situations
That's
that
word.
would be really helpful. Yeah.
Empathic design. Yeah, I agree. So let's talk about a subject that you and I sort of our favorite subjects. You and I often talk about. Um, we've reached that point now where AI and automation have become the key to next generation technologies, right? How do you see that working for or working within the accessibility ecosystem?
Yeah, we talk about this a lot and again, I don't know if we have enough time to talk about how I really
Yeah,
feel.
yeah,
Honestly, I'd be happy if we can get AI to just, replace using divs with buttons and provide more form labels and maybe automatically correct color contrast. Maybe
right,
we'll be able to retire sooner. But I look at AI as any other technology. It has the opportunity to improve the quality of life for people with disabilities, which is what I'm most interested in. And on the flip side, it could also do a lot of damage. As long as AI, like I'm interested in AI that is used to augment capabilities versus replacing humans. I
right.
think that's the key. And I think, AI, like any other technology, has the opportunity to bridge the gap a little bit more. But it's really important. We need interfaces to AI to be accessible. That's the thing, right? That's we how are people interfacing and using AI? That needs to be accessible from the beginning,
Hmm.
in order to make a big difference. Otherwise, it's going to widen the gap at an even greater pace.
Yeah, we're hearing a lot in our own community about fear of bias, right, and edging out individuals with disabilities because of these new technologies. My own personal feeling is like every new technology, it's going to take time. There's going to be a notion of maturity that we just have to let it play out. When we first were using the web, it was all character based, right? It was all text. That's all it was. When Tim was working with the browsers, he was just working with a text based browser, right? Not long after that, Mosaic came around, and now all of a sudden we had graphics that came into it, and then applications started to be developed. But we're talking 30 years ago now already, and still there's an awful lot about the web, particularly around accessibility, that requires more maturity, right? More definition, more discipline. So why would we not apply the same principles, right, to AI, to automation, especially where accessibility is concerned? Because you and I have talked about this. What I worry about the most is scale. And as much as I believe as anybody, and I started a whole company built on this, that, manual intervention, usability, are a core besides designing, upfront accessibility upfront, are a core principle. we are never going to be able to keep up with the rest of the world at the pace that we're going right now if we just leave it at that level. Do you have thoughts about that? Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. Automation is absolutely important for some of the most basic things that we have to deal with. I was joking when I talked about divs, as buttons and form labels. Like automation could take care of those things, right? We are the static analysis of those things, very easy to detect and fix. But the goal is not to, again, you're not gonna. I don't think at this point we're really far off from completely replacing any kind of manual intervention. The goal for me, at least when I'm introducing automation, is to free up the manual people from having to check and test all those things. Let them really focus on the experiential side of things, so the actual flow, right? Like I need to create a Jira ticket, I need to do a bank transfer, I need to post a tweet. If we can reduce the you know the repetitive stuff, and let the machines do that, if you will. Computers are really good about doing the same thing over and over again. Let the computers do that. Let automation do that, and we can free up, for better human testing with the experiential side. I think we're still a long way from going, to that, but that's my goal when I'm introducing automation. And the other thing is really, automation has in my opinion, has two stages. There's the first stage when it's originally introduced, when it's really used as an educational piece, right? This is how you
Right,
you
right.
you get you get people to learn, like, oh, I forgot something, or I didn't do something that I was supposed to. After a while, it ends up being muscle memory because, again, as humans, like we don't want to see that red text, those errors anymore. So we're going to do what we need to fix that. And then you get to a point where those aren't an issue anymore. It's muscle memory. And now the second life of the automation is really just like early detection, at the end of the line in case something gets missed. So I think automation certainly has a really big part to play in what we're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, and I think it will help us address remediation better too. Faster, better. Again, like you said, the low hanging fruit kind of stuff, tackle that, get it done. And then we can really put the science with the engineers, at that level working on the hardcore stuff. And it's stuff that's coming down the pipeline that we're just starting to, touch the surface of resolving and solving. Hey, as we're winding down here, Gerard, one last question. So you've worked now with a number of companies on accessibility initiatives and programs within those organizations. What business value have you seen this focus bring to companies you've worked with?
Yeah, I always tell people that accessibility is a catalyst and a magnifier for change. And it could be either good or it could be bad. So in my opinion, the companies that I've worked with that focus on accessibility, they usually have better code quality. They have more innovative designs. They all benefit from customer loyalty and great brand recognition. And internally, employees are happier because it's a more inclusive and supportive environment. Everyone loves and deserves working in a safe place. So, it sounds like a dream, but I've seen it happen where companies that focus on accessibility. Um, and again, nobody's perfect, right? Everyone's got their priorities. Everything's a progress, but those are, in my opinion, those are real impacts and benefits to focusing on accessibility. Twitter to me was the most inclusive place that I've ever worked at. Absolutely loved the culture there. Again, it wasn't perfect, but people understood the mission, right? They understood, and so I think when you have a culture that's based around inclusivity and making sure we have to treat everyone, uh, you know, with respect and dignity, and provide that level of service and independence with the products and services that we're providing, then it's just better for everyone. So again, it's just a catalyst for the good side of things.
Yeah, excellent. Very good. Thanks so much, Gerard. Gerard Cohen has been our guest today here, now with Atlassian, working on, again, is what he's great at, working on software, working on tools for developers. Gerard, it's great having you here with us today. Thanks so much for being on the HearSay podcast. Look forward to catching up with you again soon, bud.
Definitely. Thank you, Mike. Take care.
HearSay is produced by Sojin Rank, Mike Barton, Mariella, Paulino, and Missy Jensen. Edited by Alex Dorrier. If you enjoyed this podcast and don't want to miss future episodes, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.